In this demonstration, we will learn how to use the SQL Server Management Studio to investigate and create data in our SQL Server databases. The SQL Server Management Studio is one of Microsoft's client tools. The Management Studio software typically runs on a client PC and can access many different SQL servers located on server machines in a typical network environment. We will go ahead and open the SQL Server Management Studio. As we open the studio, we're always presented with this connection dialog. We're using a client tool, and we're now being asked what SQL server would we like to connect to. And further, we're being asked what type of server we would want to connect to. Let's take the server type first. We're seeing Database Engine here. In this course, we're working with the Relational Database Engine, so the answer to server type for us will always be Database Engine. However, many of you have taken some of the business intelligence courses and have seen that we might have been using the analysis services part of SQL Server to work with multidimensional analysis. Again, here in this course, we will be working with the database engine. We're only going to be working with relational databases, not multidimensional databases. Then we have to specify what server do we want to access. On any given network there could be many SQL servers, and we need to choose here. My option showing is localhost because I'm working on my laptop computer and I want to access the SQL server that is also running on my laptop computer. If you are working in a lab at school, this name might be something like N252-001. That would be a server that's running on a machine in N252 in the N building on campus. You may, at your home installation, have a named server, and you would need to enter or select that name here. We are going to be using Windows authentication for our work. Again, that's the way that most default installations would work. This means that SQL Server will trust users who have already been authenticated through the Windows authentication process. Other options here include having SQL Server do the authentication rather than the Windows operating system. For us, again, the way that we'll be working, Database Engine, localhost or named SQL Server, and Windows authentication. So now we will go ahead and connect our client software here to a particular SQL server, and on the left we will see an Object Explorer. The Object Explorer allows us to see what databases are available on this particular SQL server. If you don't see your Object Explorer, go to your View menu and choose Object Explorer. If you lose some of your windows occasionally, go to the View menu and you can usually find them there and reopen them. Here in my Object Explorer, notice I am connected to the localhost server. It would be possible for me to be connected to several different SQL servers at the same time. In fact, the Management Studio I sometimes liken to air traffic control. With the SQL Server Management Studio, an administrator can see what's happening on many different servers and many different databases. In my Object Explorer, then, I can open up the Databases folder, that folder being really simply a graphical presentation, not really a folder in the Windows operating system. And I can see numerous databases here that are in my SQL Server. At home, on your new installations, you may not see nearly this many databases. These are databases that I've worked with in various classes. Likely you would see the AdventureWorks database, because that would be installed with your SQL Server installation. That is a database that Microsoft provides simply for demonstration purposes. If we look into the AdventureWorks database, we can see that we have a number of options available to us. We can actually create database diagrams, ERDs, of databases after the fact. We can look at the tables in the database, which we're very interested in doing. Notice that the AdventureWorks demo database here is quite large, so that in addition to a table name such as employee, we also see a schema or subdivision of the tables here called human resources. Most of the databases that we'll be working with in this course are small and will not include the schema designation. We can then look into the employee table, and we can look at the columns that comprise the employee table. What data is actually stored for each row in the employee table. So we can see that we get quite a bit of information here. We have an employee ID, which is the primary key. It is an integer, and nulls are not allowed. We'll be explaining more of this information as the course progresses. Right now it's just important to know that you can navigate the databases, the tables in the databases, using the Object Explorer. If we open up the System Databases list here, we can see the databases that are required to actually run the SQL Server. We won't be changing or working with these databases, but it's important for us to know about them. The master database is where all the information about the user databases, about AdventureWorks, about Northwind, about other user databases, all that information is stored in master. Master is really required for your SQL Server to run. It's important to never delete master. It's also important to always keep a backup of your master database if you're working with a real production system. The model database is just that. It's a model that's used to create new databases. When we ask SQL Server to create a new database for us, SQL Server makes a copy of the model database, and then we add additional information for our purposes. The MSDB is an operational store of data that deals with scheduling, batch processes, all kinds of operational aspects of SQL Server. And the TempDB database is temporary storage. Sometimes when SQL Server is creating queries, working on creating queries, it needs temporary space. We are also able, as developers, to create temporary tables that exist for a short period of time. TempDB is the area that SQL Server reserves for this temporary transient work. It's important to know about TempDB, however, because in a real production system it's important to allocate sufficient space to TempDB. Those are our system databases, and again, we won't be working directly with those databases, but we will understand that they're there providing the foundation for the work that we are doing. Now let's create a kind of a blank space, a blank slate upon which we can write. I'll choose Database Engine Query to do that. Again, we're working only with the relational databases. We won't be doing any Analysis Services MDX queries, nor will we be doing any data mining queries in this course. So we would like to open a new window that will allow us to do a database engine query. Again, we need to fill out our connection dialog. Generally, this information is defaulted correctly for us, But the implication here is that every window that I open is really a separate user as far as the database is concerned. So I have a separate connection for each of the windows where I'm developing queries. I have a connection for the object browser, and I have a connection for a query window. So here on the right, I see my blank space upon which I can write SQL queries, and that's what we'll be doing for the remainder of the course. As I begin to write a query here, we'll just write something simple like select all the columns from the human resources employee table. Now when I write that query, I haven't here explicitly written that I'm using the AdventureWorks database. I could do that, or I can rely on this drop down here to specify which database I'm working in. It's important to note that we don't want to see you working in the master database or the model database. We want you to be careful about specifying which database you're working in. So here my query, I can highlight that query and click execute, and then I should see the results of that database query in the lower portion of the window. Note, for example, that if I changed the database that I was working in and said do this query in the AdventureWorks data warehouse, and now I click execute, I've changed nothing about the query, but I've specified an incorrect database, and now I have an error message. So I want to again be careful that the database is specified correctly there. Now we can note that on this same blank slate, I can go ahead and write another query. I'll this time select information from the Human Resources Department table, and if I highlight that query, I will run only that query. I can click execute or press the F5 button, and here is the result of the department table query. If I have nothing highlighted over here and I click execute or press F5, both queries are executed, and you can see that I have the results from the employee table and the results from the department table. We will be spending the bulk of the quarter learning how to write SQL statements, so ours will obviously become much more complex than what's shown here. In this particular demonstration, I want to emphasize just how to work with the SQL Server Management tool. So let's note that we could open yet another query window with yet another connection, and I could write SQL here. I could return to my original window. So I have lots of options for how I would like to do my work. In addition, we should note that what we're developing here in this SQL query window is really just text, and I could save that text in the file system somewhere. So I will call this my demo text, or my demo SQL. Notice the .sql extension there, and we will save that. By default, we go say by default we're saving here in My Documents, SQL Server Management Studio projects. You of course could save wherever you would like in your file system. Again, we are saving a file with a .sql extension, but it is simply a text file that you could open with Notepad. Similarly, if I have a SQL file already developed, I could open it and have it open. I'm opening a file now, and I'm going to navigate into my file system here and into my Prague 140 information and into my Spring 2007, into my Module 2, into my demo archive, and here's a .SQL file that I've prepared earlier. I can go ahead and open that, and again, any window I open, we're going to be presented with the connection. I need to connect, and here is some SQL that I've written earlier. Much of this in green is comments. Here's some SQL that I've written earlier that we'll be explaining in subsequent demos. The point here is that I can open already developed .SQL files and then go ahead and run the SQL as I see fit. In future demonstrations, we'll be using these same techniques over and over, and they will become second nature. So initially, you're learning to use a new tool here. It may be a bit like moving into a new home. It's a little bit confusing at first because you don't know where all your tools are, but long term it will be very effective.